Okay. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait maybe 1 minute, and then we will start. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. Well, starting. Okay, so I think we can start now. So welcome everyone to our webinar on setting science-based targets. Thank you for joining. This is the third out of our series of 4 webinars that we are holding for our low carbon supplier engagement plan. And this webinar is being recorded, so we will share the presentation following this call. And if you have any questions, please send them in the Q&A. We will answer them as we go through. We're going to pause and check for some questions at certain times during the presentation. And if there are some questions that we don't have time to cover, we will send answers following the presentation. So I am Marianne Rousseau, I'm Global ESG Procurement Lead at WSP. And today I am joined with my colleagues, Heather Hunter from VP Corporate Sustainability and ESG, and Susan McNichols, Project Consultant, Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change at WSP. So on March 22nd, we did the kickoff webinar for our low carbon supplier engagement plan. We provided an overview of the plan itself and the CDP. You can see the recording is here. You can access it by clicking this link. Same thing on our second webinar that we held on April 19 on GHG accounting, where we provided some information around conducting a GHG inventory. And you can access the information on this link as well, with as well as some reference materials on conducting GHG inventory. Today, the topic of the live event is around target setting and renewable electricity procurement. So this is what we will be talking about today, but we invite you to join us as well for our last seminar of the series on CDP, like really the Climate Disclosure Project training on answering the ORS. So that will be held on May 16. If you want to add that to your calendar, we're hoping to see you there. So when we talk about the webinar for today, specifically, the objective is at the end of this webinar, you will have a better understanding of what is a science-based target, the requirement from the Science-Based Target Initiative and goal setting timeline, the resources available to proceed in setting the science-based target approved by the SBTi, that you will have a better understanding on entering the target information into the CDP, the renewable energy target setting requirements, as well as high-level information about renewable energy procurement options. So on today's agenda, we will start with a quick reminder of WSP sustainability ambition. We will then talk about setting a science-based target, how to report the target through the CDP, and we will provide an overview of renewable electricity procurement. So quickly, as a reminder, for WSP as committed to reach net zero GHG emission across its value chain by 2040 from a 2018 base year. Our long-term target is to reduce absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 90% by 2040 from 2018 base year, and in the midterm, WSP commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 market-based GHG emissions by 60% and the scope 3 emissions by 30% by 2030 from the 2018 base year. Additionally, we commit to source 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and to better understand the GHG emission associated with the advice we give and our design, collaborating further with our business partners to drive emission reductions. So here, in terms of the requirements from our supply chain, we need your help to achieve those ambitious goals. So we are soliciting your support. We have selected U.S. suppliers of strategic importance to WSP's value chain to participate in this very important initiative for us. And such, you request that you disclose the scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions through the CDP supply chain, provide independent or third-party assurance of disclosed emissions, and how to calculate those emissions was the topic of our previous webinar. And then we are asking you to adopt the science-based target, emission reduction target by 2025 and commit to 100% renewable electricity target by 2030. So these two are the topics of the webinar today. So I will now pass it over to my colleague Suzanne, who is going to go into more details around the science-based target. So
thanks, Marianne. So
you're welcome.
The Science-Based Target Initiative, or the SBTI, is a collaboration of 4 NGOs, being CDP, the UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, or WRI, and WWF. And ultimately, the goal of the SBTI is to motivate companies to take the lead in mitigating global climate change. Participation in SBTI has continued to increase significantly since 2015, with now almost 5,000 companies participating. And we're seeing now that setting science-based targets is becoming a standard practice when companies set their climate goals. Since SBTI is an independent third party, they validate the ambitions of targets proposed by applicants. They add credibility to greenhouse gas targets. And setting an SBTI also alerts stakeholders that you are committed to meaningful climate action in line with the latest science and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So before companies started setting science-based targets, target setting was a bottom-up exercise to determine what was feasible for a company to achieve and using that as the basis for their targets. But the problem with the bottom-up approach is that it doesn't take into consideration what reductions are required in order to limit global temperature rise to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. And keeping temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius warming will result in mitigating the worst impacts and suffering from climate change across the world, which is ultimately the goal. So this is where science-based targets come in. They instead apply a top-down approach, setting the target ambition based on climate science and developing target achievement plans from there in order to limit global temperature rise overall. This changes targets from doing good to doing good enough. So just as a quick reminder, there are 3 scopes of greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 being the direct emissions from fuel combustion and refrigerant leakage, scope 2 being the indirect emissions from the purchase of electricity, steam, heating, and cooling, and then scope 3 being the indirect emissions from a company's value chain. In order to set a science-based target approved by the SBTI, you must calculate emissions for all 3 scopes. And if you haven't calculated your scope 3 emissions yet, you can start by calculating them using a screening method, and that helps you to determine which categories are relevant. and that will enable you to set an SBTI approved target. We'll go into the specifics around requirements for inclusion and coverage of each scope in the coming slides. So here on the slide, we're showing an example of what a typical SBTI target setting process and approval timeline looks like. The first step is to gain internal buy-in to set an SBTI approved target, and then to submit your commitment letter to SBTI. Then for the next year, you will work on gathering data and determining what your target will be and getting final approvals for your selected target. From the beginning of the process, you should also be considering how this target will be achieved. And so throughout the entire timeline, you'll be developing your target achievement roadmap to determine how you're going to meet this goal. Then you'll submit your application to SBTI and they'll review it. They'll likely come back with some questions and have some back and forth to iron out the target and make sure that it meets all the requirements. And then after your submission, it will take several months to get fully approved by the SBTI, and the timeline really depends on how many company targets they have to review at that time. So looking at the near-term target criteria, companies must set a near-term target in order to have their target approved by the SBTI. And there are 4 pieces to consider when setting a near-term target: time frame, boundary, ambition, and methods. And I'll explain the requirements for each of these pieces at a high level in this slide, and then we'll dive deeper into the considerations for each of them in the next few slides. So first, looking at the time frame, the near-term targets must cover a minimum of 5 years and a maximum of 10 years from the date that the target was submitted for validation. So for example, if a target was submitted in fall 2023, so the second half of 2023, the target end date must be between 2028 and 2033. Also, the base year must be no earlier than 2015. For the boundary, the emissions from scopes 1 and 2 included in the target must cover 95% of your total scope 1 and 2 emissions. And scope 3 targets are required to be set if your scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions combined. If you do need to set a scope 3 target, the scope 3 target must cover 67% of your total scope 3 emissions. In terms of the ambition, scope 1 and 2 targets must be aligned with the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And this relates to 4.2% linear annual reductions per year from the base year or from 2020, whichever is earlier. For scope 3, the targets must be aligned with a 2.5 degrees Celsius pathway, and this correlates to a 2.5% linear annual reduction per year, again from the base year or from 2020, whichever is earlier. There are also several different methods for target setting that apply differently across the scopes. So the first method is absolute reduction, which is applicable to all scopes and is one of the most common methods used to set a science-based target. The second method is sector-specific intensity convergence. And the SBTI has several sector-specific guidance documents available on their website that provide more options about this type of target, and this is only available for certain industries. For scope 2, you may set a renewable electricity target, and so this would be 80% renewable electricity by 2025 and 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And then for scope 3, you can also set a supplier engagement target instead of a percent reduction target. And it's important to note that if you do set a supplier engagement target, that you must achieve that within 5 years that the target is submitted. Finally, there's a physical or economic intensity reduction targets, which can be applied for scope 3 only, and this relates to a 7% year-on-year reduction. So in the next slide, we will look at the net zero target criteria. So companies may optionally choose to set a long-term net zero target approved by SBTI. As Marianne mentioned, WSP does have a net zero target that's approved by SBTI. And for net zero targets, the same 4 pieces apply. So timeframe, boundary, ambition, and methods, but the requirements are slightly different. So we'll jump into those now. For timeframe, the target can be no later than 2050, and you should have the same base year as you have set for your near-term target. For boundary, the scope 1 and 2 emissions is the same, so it must cover 95% of total scope 1 and 2. Again, you need to set a scope 3 target if it's greater than 40% of your total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And the ambition required for scope 3 targets, the boundary required is a bit larger for the net zero target. So instead of requiring to cover 67% of your scope 3 emissions, for the long-term target, you must cover 90% of your total scope 3 emissions. On the ambition side, for scope 1 and 2, it's the same. They have to be aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway or 4.2% linear annual reduction. But for scope 3, the ambition is also more aggressive, and that needs to be aligned with a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway or 4.2% reduction instead of the well below 2 degrees Celsius pathway that correlates with 2.5% reduction. And ultimately, these ambitions result in a 90% reduction. The methods are the same as for the near-term targets. Just one thing to point out is that for scope 3, a 97% reduction is now required if you're setting a physical or economic intensity target. So SBTI does have a slightly different process for small and medium-sized enterprises to set an SBTI approved target. And for SBTI, an SME is defined as a non-subsidiary independent company with less than 500 employees. So if this applies to your company, you'll have a slightly different set of rules for setting an SBTI target. And just to highlight some of the key differences, SMEs can bypass the initial stage of committing to setting a science-based target, and they can immediately go through the target setting process. And there's a form that we will link, and you can click on this after, that makes the process a bit easier for these SMEs. And another thing to note is that for the near-term targets, SMEs are not required to set scope 3 emissions reduction targets, but they must commit to measuring and reducing their scope 3 emissions. So we have a link here at the bottom to the FAQs for SMEs, and this will be a really helpful resource if your company falls into this bucket. So now let's look a little bit closer at the key considerations for choosing a target timeframe. To ground everyone on the terminology here, when we say base year, that means the starting point for emissions reductions, and target year is the endpoint for emissions reductions. When you choose your base year, there are a few things that you should keep in mind. First and foremost, you must have a comprehensive and verifiable scope 1 to 3 inventory in your base year. And building off that, you should consider timing of recent acquisitions and what your ability is to collect and reconcile past data related to those acquisitions to ensure that you have a comprehensive inventory. And so just be aware of that when you select your base year, and ultimately making sure that you have a comprehensive inventory in that year. Also, your base year should be representative of a typical emissions profile for your company. And so, for example, this would mean that it's not impacted by COVID-19. For many companies, 2020 may have been very different from regular business operations. And so 2020 would not be a good base year to select because companies were not operating under typical circumstances. You must also ensure when you select your base year that your targets have sufficient forward-looking ambition. And I'm not going to dive into too many of the specifics around forward-looking ambition. You can read into this in the SBTI documentation, but At a high level, forward-looking ambition adjustments come into play if you have already achieved significant reductions from your selected base year. And so if that's the case, your percent reduction may need to be more ambitious than the 4.2% reduction per year. And the SBTI has an Excel tool that you can input your base year and target year as well as emissions information into, and then that will automatically determine if you have a forward-looking adjustment requirement for your target. And then finally, SBTI requires a base year no earlier than 2015, as mentioned. There are also several things to consider when you select your target year. On the one hand, a shorter term goal provides more certainty with respect to your business changes, growth, and initiatives, which will be really important when you build out your roadmap and determine how you're going to achieve your target. But on the other hand, a longer goal period enables you to have a more aggressive goal and provides you a bit more flexibility with obtaining it if you don't already have initiatives in place to get there. You should weigh out those considerations against your business strategies and goals to decide what year makes the most sense for your company. And one thing to note for near-term target years, it should be near enough to provide a meaningful milestone for prioritizing strategies, but it should provide enough of planning horizon so that you can feasibly achieve the target by that date. To ensure consistency with the most recent climate science, the SBTI requires that your targets are reviewed and, if necessary, recalculated and revalidated at a minimum of every 5 years. So now let's look a bit closer at the key considerations for choosing your target boundary. For Scope 1 and 2, again, it's required that you cover 95% of your total emissions, but in practice, most companies do include all of their Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and exclusions would typically occur in cases such as when you have a business acquisition with low transparency and confidence of emissions for a certain category, or if there's an emission source that falls into the inventory boundary, but you have very limited control in reducing those emissions. For Scope 3 near-term targets, again, you need to cover 67% of your Scope 3 emissions, and so you have some leeway here to select which Scope 3 categories you include in your target. And so in order to select which Scope 3 categories you want to include, you should think about prioritizing categories with large emissions and focusing on including those categories where you have high confidence that you can achieve greenhouse gas reductions. You also want to include categories where you have the ability to implement and monitor greenhouse gas reductions over time. So for example, if you're calculating your purchased goods and services emissions using EEIO factors or industry-based factors, you'll want to move forward to more mature methods where you can actually get supplier-specific emissions factors to track reductions over time. And then finally, for your long-term Scope 3 target, you must include 90% of all your Scope 3 emissions. And for this, you should really only exclude those categories that are not material for your company. So now taking a deeper look at the different target setting methods. First, starting with absolute targets. On the positive side for absolute targets, they're designed to reduce absolute quantity of emissions. They're really easy to communicate, are transparent, and demonstrate strong ambition, and they have a lower data requirement and are a pretty straightforward approach. Some drawbacks around the absolute method is that it doesn't really allow for a comparison of greenhouse gas intensity among peers and doesn't directly communicate the impact of efficiency improvements. And it may be more difficult to achieve an absolute target if your growth of your company is linked to greenhouse gas emissions. But one thing to note is that you can elect to track greenhouse gas intensities over time, even if you have an absolute target. Physical intensity targets can be applied for Scope 3 only. And they're on the positive side, these are good because they allow for comparison against your peers. They do reflect efficiency improvements, and they're independent of business growth or decline. And they're potentially more in line with internal progress tracking that you already have in place. On the other hand, some drawbacks around physical intensity targets include higher data requirements. So you'll need to gather data on units of products sold, mass of raw materials, for example, or floor space. And these types of targets may be more difficult for companies that have a very diverse range of products and operations, where it's not so easy to choose one single physical intensity business metric that can go across all of your emissions. Economic intensity targets can also only be applied for Scope 3. These are positive because, again, they also allow for comparison among peers. They provide more flexibility if your company is prioritizing growth, and they're more suitable for your company if you have diverse products and services, like I mentioned. Some drawbacks on the economic intensity targets, though, they're really subject to factors that can result in changes to the carbon intensity, but aren't actually linked to emissions reductions. As we all know, prices fluctuate very widely, and we've experienced significant inflation, so that type of economic adjustment is not directly linked to greenhouse gas emissions changes. Additionally, economic targets are also seen as less robust, again, as I mentioned, due to the volatility of economic metrics. Supplier engagement targets can be applied for Scope 3 near-term targets only, and these are positive targets because they require less data, and it can allow companies with limited data or information on suitable Scope 3 reduction levers to take action this way. Also, it helps to scale up science-based targets globally, which is ultimately the goal of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Some drawbacks around supplier engagement targets, though, they have less transparency and certainty of real emissions reductions, since the metric is just around % of suppliers or customers engaged and not around actual emissions reductions. And the strategies to achieve this target are limited since it only focuses on engagement. So now taking a look at some of the common target achievement reduction levers. The first place you want to start is around facility energy efficiency. So you should undertake projects to reduce the overall energy consumed at your sites first. And the upside of these projects is that they can also be a lever for cost savings, which presents a really attractive business case. So this is a place you want to start first. Then once you've optimized your energy efficiency, you should pursue renewable electricity. This can come in several different forms, including on-site renewables, direct renewable electricity sourcing, or renewable electricity credit procurement. And I'll go into more details about renewable electricity later on in the presentation, so we'll provide some more details about those options. Another key lever is your product design and procurement, specifically around your Scope 3 emissions. So this would include increasing the efficiency and lowering the carbon footprint of the products that you produce, and also working with your suppliers to influence them to address their own emissions through your procurement decisions, which you may have significant influence over those suppliers. You can also pursue fuel switching options with your transportation suppliers to reduce Scope 3 emissions. And finally, you can address your business travel and employee commuting emissions by updating business travel guidelines to encourage employees to use lower emissions transportation options, for example, using train transportation instead of air transportation, or even encouraging them to host virtual meetings if possible instead of traveling. Also, you can offer more flexible work schedules to help reduce employee commuting emissions as well. So now we'll look at how to report your targets through the CDP ORS. This falls into question C 4.1 in CDP. And the first thing that you need to select is which type of target you have. And so for this example, we're going to highlight what you would input for an absolute target, which, as I mentioned, is the most common type of science-based target that companies set. Next slide, please. So when you're filling out the questions in CDP, make sure that you complete all the fields and don't leave any of them blank, as this will cause errors in the CDP ORS. First, you'll need to assign a unique target reference number, as you may have several different targets, such as Scope 1 and 2 targets and a separate Scope 3 target. Then you must indicate whether the target is science-based, which, as WSP is expecting suppliers to set science-based targets, it should be. And then you select what the target ambition is. So that would be 1.5C aligned for Scope 1 and 2, and well below 2C for Scope 3. Then you select what year you set the target, what is covered in the target, and this should be your entire company-wide operations should be covered in your science-based targets. As I mentioned, should cover 95% of Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then for Scope 3 would cover 67% for near term and 90% for long term. Then you select which scopes the target covers, so that's between Scope 1, 2, and 3. And then specifically, if it's a Scope 2 target, selecting which method you're using for your Scope 2 emissions, so market-based or location-based. Then entering the base year for your target and all the emissions covered in the base year. Then entering your target year, your targeted percent reduction. And then you must also report the tons of CO2e of Scope 1 and 2 emissions covered in the target year, which should match the total Scope 1, 2 emissions in the target year. And then you must specify also next slide. If your target covers land-related emissions and the current status of your target. And so if you have any questions about this, I recommend that you bring them up either at the end of this webinar or after you have a chance to look in the ORS. You can raise them at our CDP training taking place on May 16th. So right now we'll pause to see if there are any questions so far. Marianne, were there any questions in the chat?
No, thank you, Susan. Just a reminder for everyone that we will be sharing the slides and the recording following the webinar.
Awesome. Thanks, Marianne.
But no question in the chat, so you can continue.
Awesome. Okay, so now we'll transition away from SBTI to talking about renewable electricity. As Marianne mentioned, as part of our supplier reduction and disclosure requirements, all strategically selected WSP global suppliers, which includes you if you're attending this webinar, are required to commit to a 100% renewable electricity target that covers your entire company-wide operations and should be achieved by 2030 or sooner. And just to note that once you achieve the 100% renewable electricity in 2030, that 100% renewable electricity must be maintained for all years beyond, even if your electricity usage increases. There are several different sources of electricity. Conventionally, electricity has come from oil, coal, natural gas, and nuclear sources, which are the least beneficial from an environmental and a climate perspective. Then there's what we call renewable energy, which includes large hydropower and municipal solid waste, which is more beneficial than conventional. And then finally, the most beneficial sources of electricity are what we call green power, coming from sources like wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, biogas, and low impact hydropower. In the coming slides, we're going to talk about ways to procure renewable energy and green power to move away from those conventional types to ones that are more beneficial. So in our market-based accounting system, renewable energy projects produce two things. The first being electrons, and the second being their renewable attributes. When the attributes travel with the electrons, it's called bundled renewables. And when they travel separately, it's called unbundled renewables. And the key thing to remember here is that the renewable attributes are what count towards market-based Scope 2 emissions reductions in your greenhouse gas inventory, not the electrons. And so it's important to build your renewable electricity strategy around obtaining RECs. And we'll talk about the different ways to get them. But one example where you might have the electrons but not the RECs would be if you have on-site solar panels at your facility, but the contract that was set up has those RECs being sold to another company. So even though you have on-site solar panels and you're getting electrons from that, you can't claim emissions reductions in your Scope 2 inventory because that other company has the renewable attributes and has the claim to the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that's something you want to be very aware of when you're setting up your renewable electricity projects. There are several different options for procuring renewable electricity in order to meet your goals, and we can group these options into 4 buckets. The first being retail supply, the second being unbundled solutions, the third being on-site or near-site projects, and then the fourth being off-site projects. So looking more closely at retail supply options, these can be things such as community choice aggregation, green tariffs, or retail agreements. And these options will either be available through municipal programs or directly from your utility provider. And as long as you have appropriate documentation of the renewable attributes, then you can claim emissions reductions when you're participating in these retail supply programs. The second option are unbundled solutions. Again, as I mentioned, unbundle means that there's no physical transmission of the electricity to the purchaser. And so the purchaser receives sole claim of the environmental attributes, and that enables them to claim Scope 2 reductions in their inventory. Unbundled RECs can be purchased in 2 ways. The first through the spot market through a broker. And this process is typically done on an annual basis. But one thing to note is that the prices when purchasing on the spot market are typically very volatile in many of the markets. The alternative option is attribute purchase agreements, or APAs, and these are contracts for the long-term purchase of RECs. And one upside of this is that it provides set prices over the entire contract term that you sign the APA for. The third option is on-site or near-site projects. So one example of this would be owned generation, meaning that renewable electricity is generated on your side of the utility meter. So this would be something like solar panels on your facility that your company owns. Another way that you can achieve this is through power purchase agreements, or PPAs. And this means that your facility does not own the generation equipment. And again, it's important to negotiate a PPA contract to ensure that you retain the environmental attributes, which is what will enable you to reflect emissions reductions in your Scope 2 inventory. The fourth option is offsite projects. This can be through something called virtual PPAs, or VPPAs. And these are basically financial contracts for environmental attributes associated with a renewable electricity project. And then a second option is through tax equity investment with RECs. And so basically this would entail your company financing a renewable energy development project, and this would be structured so that you get to claim the RECs and the emissions reductions. So let's take a closer look at these options and the associated costs, return on investment, and perception of impact. So the options here are listed in a strategic order in the table, with the highest being the top of the table representing the highest perception of impact and the bottom of the table representing the lowest perception of impact. And just diving a little bit deeper into what we mean by impact. Projects have high impact when they result in new renewable energy facilities being built. So for many projects, the impact comes from making a new project viable by either providing a revenue stream or funding that project directly, meaning that it wouldn't have happened otherwise without your company supporting that project. So the impact of different projects is not very precise. Many different factors come into play, but it is clear that buying unbundled renewable energy certificates or unbundled RECs from an unknown source or from an already existing facility is considered low impact or non-additional, whereas incentivizing new renewable electricity capacity and consuming those electrons is seen as more impactful. And this would be, for example, if you had owned on-site generation, would be a very impactful option. Another thing to consider about your, sorry, Marianne, if you can go back. Thanks. Another thing to consider is the cost of these options. With owned generation, there's a higher upfront cost, but over the long term, the cost may be more favorable. Whereas for PPAs, the cost is not as high upfront, but it would be more over the long term. And so when you think about on-site generation compared to PPAs, it would be similar to thinking about owning versus leasing a car. For green tariffs, you may be charged a premium from your utility provider, and that's something you'll need to look into. And then for unbundled RECs, the upfront cost is relatively low, but you'll need to continue to purchase these year over year. And so the cost does add up over time. And unbundled RECs don't have a return on investment like you would have with PPAs or owned on-site or off-site generation. So it's really important to consider all these factors and determine what makes the most sense for your company based on the different outputs for each project type. So just diving a little deeper into the risks and trade-offs associated with each renewable electricity option, I'll walk through some of these considerations for each type. So starting with utility green tariffs, these are a great option because they're really easy to implement. It wouldn't be much different from how you're currently purchasing your electricity, and it helps you avoid those more complex transactions and contracting. The downside is, though, that these aren't available in all locations, and so you'll need to do some research to see where, if this is available at your facilities. Sleeved PPAs are a great option because they're easy to implement and they have high impact. And they also ensure that you have renewable electricity certificates for the long term. But one thing to note is that these aren't available in all countries. And so you'll need to look into the availability where your sites are located. And another thing to note is that you might have to have a minimum electricity size in order to be considered for a sleeve PPA. So if your electricity usage is lower, this might not be an option for you. Financial investment through APAs, also known as long-term REC contracts, are good because they provide RECs for the long term at a fixed price. And this is a good option if PPAs aren't available where your site is located. Again, the downside is that the price is fixed. So if the spot market REC prices go down, you might end up overpaying for RECs in the long term. Financial investment through VPPAs are beneficial because they provide long-term REC coverage, and they also have more flexibility. So for this type of PPA option, your facility does not have to be in the same power generation location as the facility where the RECs are applied to. And so this gives you a bit more flexibility. Physical PPAs are beneficial as they allow you, again, to procure RECs at a large scale and help save money. But on the other hand, these projects do require that you take RECs from projects that are in the same power market as where your facility is located, and your company must also be licensed to operate in the wholesale market. These PPA transactions are also more complicated and might require legal counsel to conduct them. On-site solar photovoltaic is a good option because it provides cost savings from avoided electricity costs and REC purchases. One thing to be aware of is that your roof needs to be new enough to support the infrastructure, and the panels might not be able to cover your entire site's electricity load. Finally, unbundled RECs are a really easy option to implement, and they take minimal effort to maintain, but they're lower impact and they don't support the generation of new renewable electricity projects. Also, you may be overpaying over the long term as compared to the other options that have a return on investment. So you may be wondering, what's available at my site? And there are many resources out there that can help you to determine what options are available. The first is the Clean Energy Buyers Association US Clean Energy Map, shown here on the left. And this shows where different utility renewable energy deals are available. And when you think about engaging your utility providers, the important thing to think about is first whether your company actually pays the utility bill, or if your landlord does, and you'll have to contact your landlord who is interfacing with the utility provider. You want to focus on sites where the grid emissions intensity is the highest first, so you can have the most emissions reductions. And then focusing on those sites based on the map that have these types of green tariff options available. The second resource is the 3 degrees REC and global EAC map, which shows different availability for energy attributes globally. And we'll share the links to both of these after so you can dive into them in more detail. So now that we've reviewed the different renewable electricity options, we'll look at how these options fit into the Scope 2 market-based greenhouse gas accounting framework. So the top of the list represents the most precise methods for accounting for renewable electricity, and then the bottom of the list is least precise. So starting with energy attribute certificates or EACs, for example, these would be things like RECs in the US or GOES in Europe. These are the most precise way to achieve Scope 2 emissions reductions, and they enable you to use a zero emissions factor. It's important to be prepared to provide documentation around these EACs to make sure that they meet the Scope 2 quality criteria. And I recommend that you review the Scope 2 quality criteria, which you can find in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 guidance. You can also achieve Scope 2 reductions from contracts such as PPAs that convey environmental attributes when an EAC system isn't specifically in place in that country. The next option is to use a supplier-specific emissions factor directly from your energy supplier. So this would be like, for example, if you're using green tariffs, your utility provider would then provide you with a supplier-specific emissions factor. If those options aren't available and applicable to you, then you should use an emissions factor that's set up so that it doesn't double count the reductions from renewable energy projects on the grid that are already being claimed for. So one example of how to do this would be using the EU residual grid mix. Finally, if none of those options are available for a site, then you can use the location-based grid average factors. And in that case, your market-based emissions will be the same as your location-based. So closing out with a roadmap for renewable energy procurement, this diagram outlines the general process for developing this roadmap, and we adapted this from the CHIBA guidelines. The first step is to determine your total electricity load and your company goals, which in this case is 100% renewable electricity by 2030. And then the second step is to determine what contract and technology options are available in the countries where your facilities are located. So this would entail going through all the options that we've discussed throughout this presentation and doing some research to understand what's available at your different sites. The third step is then to develop your market approach based on the research that you've done. It's important in this step to build internal support and an internal team who will be responsible for handling the contracting of your renewable electricity projects. The output from this step will be a RE procurement plan. And so one example might be maybe you have 5 sites in the US where green tariffs are available. And so you apply that at those sites. And then for the rest of your US sites, you choose to do a virtual PPA. And then maybe you have a few sites in Asia where on-site solar makes sense. And so this is your plan for renewable electricity coverage at your different locations. The fourth step is to determine the risk tolerances your company has and keep those in mind as you're going through the contracting process, and make sure to include questions that cover the risks in your request for proposal. The fifth step is actually conducting the request for proposal to get quotes from different renewable electricity providers. And in this step, you should also be gaining C-suite approval for what your plans are. The sixth step is then to negotiate contracts with the selected providers and to obtain final internal approvals before you sign your contract. And the last 2 steps are only applicable if you're pursuing certain types of renewable electricity where there's new operations coming online. And if that's the case, you want to make sure to finalize all the pre-commercial operation date details as soon as you can, and then make sure to follow up with the provider post the commercial operation date to make sure everything is going as planned. So finally, to summarize, the first step before setting your targets is to calculate your greenhouse gas inventory. Again, as Marianne mentioned, if you're new to this process, you can watch our greenhouse gas accounting webinar in the link that will be provided in the first slide of this training. Once you have completed your inventory, you should start the process to set your target, gain internal approval, and then finally obtain external approval from SBTI. Additionally, you should set a 100% renewable electricity target that will be achieved no later than 2030, and work on developing your renewable electricity procurement strategy so that you can meet your 100% goal. On this slide, we have some helpful resources that you can reference when setting your science-based target, and we'll share the slides after with a link to these resources that can be a great starting point for further review. Similarly, we have some resources for renewable electricity procurement, and we'll share these links out after as well. And these will be a great starting point for further review around your renewable electricity procurement strategy. So finally, to close out, we just have a few reminders. First reminder is please register for CDP if you haven't done so already. As Marianne mentioned, we do have a training next week going into more detail about the CDP ORS, and this will be a great chance to ask any questions that might have popped up when you've jumped into the ORS so far. So please add that to your calendar and plan to attend. A reminder that the deadline for submitting your emissions through CDP is July 26th. And we'd like to remind you that WSP's base year is 2018 for our targets. And so if you have emissions information available for 2018, we ask that you report that in question C6.1, 6.3, and 6.5. Finally, begin the socialization of setting an SBTI-based target as well as a renewable electricity target internally. so that you can gain those approvals to officially set those targets in line with what WSP is asking. As Marian mentioned, we do need your support in order to achieve our Scope 3 targets, and we really appreciate your collaboration in this process. So with that, thank you so much for listening and attending, and we'll open it up in the last 5 minutes to see if there are any questions. So please type your questions into the Q&A chat box, and we will try to answer them.
Yeah, Susan, we've got one question. It's more about answering to the CDP. So for professional service companies that do operate in several different primary sector, but don't actually produce anything in those sectors, what should they confirm in the questionnaire? Should they mark themselves as all sectors, or should they select the one that they serve primarily?
I am not immediately familiar with what all the CDP sectors are, so if okay, I'd like to follow up on this one offline and send out an email back to the group. My first thought is that the sector might be professional services, because WSP would fall into this same category, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the sector is called. So we will follow up with an email answering that question offline.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any other questions, but if you have anything else, any other questions also that you think of after reviewing the documentation, the presentation that we share, feel free to send us an email at sustainableprocurement@WSP.com, or for the US, it's US sustainableprocurement@WSP.com, and we'll go through that and provide answers. And as Susan mentioned, we will be sharing this presentation as well as the recording of the webinar a few days, within a few days. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope to see you in the next webinar next week. We just got another question that just popped up as we're about to close. So if we're asking if we are requiring the 100% use of electrical vehicles by 2030.
No, so the 100% is just around renewable electricity related to your Scope 2 emissions. So there's no specific requirement around 100% electric vehicles by 2030, although that might help enable you to achieve Scope 1 reductions to achieve your science-based target, but we're not prescribing anything specific around electric vehicles at this time.
Great, thank you. So again, if there's any other questions, please feel free to email us at sustainableprocurement@WSP.com, and we will be sharing the documents from this presentation and the recording. And thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.